I'm Peter Tyrer, and my monozygotic twin brother Stephen will be acting as the rapporteur for this session, and Charlotte from Cambridge University Press will be assisting with the technology. I hope this launch will prove that the subject is important and will change your professional lives forever. From now on, it's downhill. I've just returned from Stockholm, where I was introduced by the Swedish Research Council as the representative from the disunited kingdom. Unfortunately, that is the image we project at the moment, but this particular launch is all about unity. And in case you are feeling pessimistic, I would like to remind you that the century after the Great Plague of London, followed by the Great Fire of London, when everyone was incredibly down and pessimistic, this was followed by a century which enjoyed the greatest renaissance in its economy, its culture, and its science that it has ever done. So let's hope the same applies to neurosis. So this is the talk. This is the book that has just been published on the 20th of October. Next slide. And Samuel Johnson in 1755 defined nervous, and it's interesting to look at that because he was defining it in two ways. He said you're well strung and strong and vigorous, but at the same time, in medical cant, having weak or diseased nerves. So this is interesting because it shows the two elements of neurosis. There is an element of strength and an element of weakness. And if in fact he had published his book in 1780 or so, not in 1755, I'm sure he would have put in neurosis in the dictionary, because this was described by William Cullen, a Scottish psychiatrist, at the time of the Scottish Enlightenment in 1777. And that was when it was first used in practice and widely used, particularly across the continent of Europe in the subsequent 100 years, and then lasted until 1980. And then who should come along in 1980? But next one, Robert Spitzer. He was the architect of DSM-III. For those who will know DSM, it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, which has tried to take over from the official classification, the World Health Organization classification, ever since 1980. It still hasn't succeeded and never will, because it really is far too US based. But he said in this paper that when the task force, the DSM, looked at whether or not they should include neurosis, they never seriously considered it. I don't think that was strictly true, because even now, depressive neurosis appears in the latest edition of DSM. So they haven't lost it entirely, but they've tried to get rid of it entirely. And what have they replaced it by? Next slide. This nonsense: dysthymic disorder, major depressive episode, recurrent and single depressive episodes, premenstrual depressive disorder. See, we can go on incessantly about this. And then all the anxiety disorders come in as well, especially all these different phobias. And Uncle Tom Cobley which I don't think is described, but obviously describes all the others we haven't named properly. And this is how we now describe neurosis. I'm putting it to you that this has not been a major advantage. Next one. And then in 1972, a series of papers were published by Sir Martin Roth and colleagues in Newcastle. It's often called the Newcastle Group. And Sir Martin showed that the symptoms of depression and anxiety could be very clearly separated. What he did not show was that the patients with anxiety and depression could be separated similarly. But this became a core of management. And what happened then is that the idea was that if you got depression, you were treated with drugs, and then anxiety disorders, which were slightly different, you were sent them to the psychologist or treated them yourself with various psychological methods. So we were splitting this these two disorders on the basis that they were completely different. But then my colleague, Glyn Lewis, came along. Next slide. And he showed that when you asked patients to score their anxiety and depression on scales, they found out that the anxiety and depression scales had 0.59 correlation. Correlations between 0 and 1 and 0.59 is pretty good. But when in fact the psychiatrist did it, using a separate scale in which they assessed the same patients, it was only 0.29. And then he found out separately that when they were rating their own anxiety and depression, they showed a similar poor correlation. And it was therefore reasonable to conclude that psychiatrists were showing bias in their assessments. So I call this the Lewis prediction in my book, saying when symptoms of anxiety and depression are both present, the psychiatrist is trained to separate them even when they're of equal importance. Now, this doesn't just apply to anxiety and depression. It's one of the problems with diagnosis. When in fact we produce a diagnosis in a classification and psychiatrists take it up, they tend to regard it as walled off and pure, and they will separate it from other conditions which may be very close. So, for example, bipolar 2 is a new diagnosis in the latest classification, and people are now being trained to separate that off from bipolar 1 and the other types of bipolar problems which are not quite classifiable, when in fact they're all part of a spectrum. And unfortunately, this is where we get, when we make a wrong diagnosis, we make psychiatrists far too insular and protective of these diagnoses, so they tend to go on using them. And then those with lived experience, patients, that's the expression we use now, they come along and say, well, it's not, that's nonsense. We in fact know that these are all close together. And I think we ought to be listening more to the people with lived experience in these instances than we do to psychiatrists. Next one. And this is the paper I published in The Lancet in 1985, which is the beginning of this story. And The Lancet likes to be there at the beginning and there at the end. So I'm hoping that this was the beginning and the end will consist of a review of my book. In The Lancet, that would finish off the series according to the Lancet hypothesis. This is the way they like to do things. And basically the whole of neurosis can be put into concentric circles like this. And what happens, these people are more vulnerable to life events of various sorts. And so when they get a lot of negative ones, they get all these symptoms coming back, and then they go back to how they were before. And behind all this is their personality, often called neuroticism. And these are people who are vulnerable to stresses, and this comes over as neuroticism, and it's one of the big 5 personality characteristics described in normal people. Next one. In 1989, I published a book, The Classification of Neurosis, and this had a foreword by Robert Kendall, which included these words. Now, those who knew Bob Kendall, who unfortunately died prematurely in the early years of this century, he was a very precise diagnostician. He didn't write anything which he didn't really look at very carefully before he put it down. And this quote shows he fully supported this. The only other people who took this on were Gavin Andrews, who's a very perceptive psychiatrist in Australia who wrote a paper on the general neurotic syndrome, and Michael Rutter and his group, who did a 20-year follow-up of children and found out that the symptoms of the general neurotic syndrome in children were persistent, and they were still there 20 years later. This emphasizes the value of long-term follow-up, and I'll be talking about that later. Next one. So why am I resurrecting it now? Well, because we've just finished our 30-year study, which I'm going to be talking about, but also because it's a very good example of a Galenic syndrome, a combination of mental state disorders with personality disturbance. Next one. And this paper, which has recently been published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, emphasizes that these are combinations of mental state and personality disorders too closely entwined to be separated. And Garland described this in 192 AD. I repeat, 192 AD, a long time ago, when everyone believed in the humoral system. And he said that choleric, red bile people, lots of red bile made them bad-tempered and angry. Those with lots of black bile were miserable and melancholic and got anxious and depressed and were pessimistic. Those with lots of phlegm were phlegmatic and were distant, detached and didn't care much about things. And those who were sanguine were full of blood and full of energy and positivity. So I think it's right to call these Galenic syndromes. Next one. And the most important one is the general neurotic syndrome. And I know we've got several people joining us from Romania where they're trying to set up a community psychiatric association. Just a reminder to my colleagues from Romania, these people will comprise 90% of the patients you see in your new community psychiatric services. Next one. Here is an excellent exemplar. Next one. Now, for those who know their English literature, a woman of mean understanding, little information and uncertain temper, and when I am discontented, I fancy myself nervous. This is Mrs. Bennet from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Next slide. And as she would say, this is rubbish. She needs a sensible psychiatrist to write about me as I am, anxious, depressed, and unashamedly neurotic. And what Jane Austen does, she uses Mrs. Bennet as a figure of fun, and then she pokes fun at her, and she's just a booby in this book. But as everyone will know when they see patients with this condition, she's not faking her symptoms, which is the impression given by Jane Austen. She doesn't fancy herself nervous. She has always been nervous. And so when he says, when she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous, it's just not true. He's saying very clearly she has both depressive and anxiety symptoms. Next one. And this is the opposite of the truth. Mrs. Bennet's the only clear-headed member of the Bennet household. She shows the evolutionary benefit of this syndrome. And if she didn't have her head screwed on, she would really have allowed the family home to be lost and disintegrate. And yet she is regarded as an incompetent member of the household when she's quite the opposite. So this is the well-strung, strong, vigorous element. Next one. Next one. There she has 5 daughters, unencumbered by fortune. What will you do if you were me? She's got to get them married off. There's no possibility in 1817 she's going to get any other way of moving forward with preserving the estate. And Mr. Bennet there, who comes over as very amusing and detached, he's doing nothing to help at all. Only Mrs. Bennet is doing the job. Next one. But this is not just about Mrs. Bennet. It describes a personal journey. It's partial biography because it starts off in Southampton way back in 1973, when I got dissatisfied with depression and anxiety being separate conditions. And when I was a consultant at Knowle Hospital in Hampshire in the mid-1970s, I remember a very keen registrar who said in an account of a patient, well, this patient has both anxiety and depression, and I don't think I can separate them, and was told off by the professor, you've got to make that separation because otherwise you'll fail your MRC psych examinations. Unfortunately, that person got so traumatized by this criticism, he left psychiatry afterwards. But of course, he was absolutely right. Anxiety and depression are very common in the same person. And this was shown in the Nottingham study of neurotic disorder, which started in 1983 and was stimulated by a conversation I had with Jean Paykel, who said, if you want to do a study like this, you might as well get on with it because no one else is going to fund it. Get started and don't hang back. So, and I'm going to finish by saying how we can redress the balance of getting this right. Next one. This is where the first big paper on it. This was the paper of the Saturday, the 30th of July, 1988, and this was the account of this study. The first account, the first 10 weeks. Next slide. And this showed that when you treated people with a lot of different approaches, After 10 weeks, there was very little difference between them, because if you treated people 6 weeks and then gradually tailed off their treatment, then in fact you had a different outcome from if you just stopped after 6 weeks. And the people on diazepam, because in fact they were withdrawn and then had some withdrawal symptoms that were not properly recognized, then they were worse off than all the others after 10 weeks. And we found there was less value for those who had the general neurotic syndrome, with the personality disturbances of depression and obsessional symptoms, obsessional characteristics to their personality. Next one. And this shows this in a logarithmic scale. This is between 10 weeks and 30 years. And you can see those with a general neurotic syndrome had a higher score here. A score of 17 is pathological in this scale, a comprehensive psychopathological rating scale. And after 10 weeks, they were hardly better, and they didn't really improve at all. And by the time they got to 30 years, they were worse. These were better after 10 weeks, but actually were not that much better, although they still weren't symptomatic, and the mean wasn't symptomatic at 30 years. So people with the general neurotic syndrome did badly, and others didn't do especially well either, because even though we get the impression they do, in the longer term, they don't. Next one. And no one paid much attention to this, their personalities in this study. I didn't do it. We just measured it. We had no particular intervention for their personality problems. But one thing that we found out when we looked at the outcome in terms of their environmental changes, which was something which we recorded regularly with the help of my wife Helen during the course of this follow-up study, we got a different result. Next one, the rest of this slide here. So here we have those who had a positive environmental change here. Look at these scores. Their social functioning 5.3, 6 is normal. So they went back to below normal. If it didn't have, if it had a negative change, it was well of 8.7. If they had no change at all and just stuck where they were, that was even worse. And the other scales, these are all this is the comprehensive scale, these are depression scales, and these are anxiety scales. All these showed greater benefit in those who had positive environmental change. So the idea behind this was that we don't just regard these as life events that happen. If we're going to make a change, we've got to try and interfere with these life events and make them happen in a positive direction. Next slide. And those with personality disorders, these are all great statistical manipulations carried out by my colleague Min Yang, who's joining us from Melbourne in Australia. We found that those with personality disorder, few of them had positive change than had no personality disorder. And this is one of the reasons why in the first 12 years, they were worse off. Interesting, this in the next 18 years, the changes weren't shown, partly because personality disorder was shifting. And many people think personality disorder doesn't shift, but it does shift over time. And these in the second half, we didn't find the same findings. But in the first half, we had a very strong relationship between those with no personality disorder doing much better than those who had personality disorder when it comes to environmental positive changes. Next one. I'm now getting to near the end of my talk, and I know my brother's going to interrupt me shortly. How can we have
One more minute. One more minute.
So here's a man. 1 more minute. He's already talking. By employing nidotherapy, which is a collaborative systematic assessment of the environment. Let's see how this might work with Mrs. Bennett. Next one. As you said earlier, Mrs. Bennett, you have suffered from your nerves for quite long. This is the psychiatrist in 1817. This is an affliction which is likely to continue for quite a long time. So he's saying he's pessimistic about the outcome. Oh, don't say that, doctor. You cannot offer me hope. I'm done. That I cannot tolerate. I can feel another wave coming on. I must lie down. So let me finish, Mrs. Bennett. What you need to do is organise your life more carefully so the ups and downs of your nerves can be made tolerable. How can I do that, Dr. Mrs. Bennett? And my 5 daughters, they lead me up and down with their fancy notions. I can't keep up with them. But that, Mrs. Bennett, if you understand them so well, you should anticipate what they're going to say or do. That's a core part of nidotherapy. You work out what the person is thinking, what their knowledge is of a complicated subject, which is their lives. And of course, he flatters her by saying, like the back of your still elegant hand, oh, you flatter me, doctor, I can see through you. Oh, but what can I do if they're governed by caprice and impulse? Next slide, please. just stop making an unwanted entry. You're an intelligent woman. And then you give a little diary to Mrs. Bennet to say what she does. And I'm sure if you went through this exercise, you'd find an answer. For example, when Mr. Bennet retires to the library whenever trouble is around, perhaps it would be possible, Mrs. Bennet, for you to retire to the library these times and let Mr. Bennet deal with any problems that arise. I'm beginning to get an idea you're talking about, Doctor. I think the right word is control. I can control my circumstances. I can control my nerves. I really think you have it, Mrs. Bennet. Up until now, you've allowed events in your life to control you. Now is the time for you to control them. Oh, I don't know how to thank you, Mrs. I must go and tell my daughter immediately. No, mustn't. You have to wait for your next appointment until we've seen whether things are sorted out. This is the psychiatrist practicing night therapy with Mrs. Bennet in 1817. Next one. And this is there you have it. Now tell it to the world. There's the book. Thank you. Time for questions. I see David's asking a question about my problem has been very helpful to have different problem diagnoses like OCD and panic disorder to help development of various specific CBT models and successful treatments. I'm not sure if you're arguing to get rid of these descriptions or everyone with OCD or panic has general neurotic syndrome. No, I'm not saying that, David, at all. I'm just saying that a proportion of them do. And what we often do is we highlight one part of a mix of neurotic symptomatology, and we give it special meaning by saying, well, really behind all this is your OCD. I don't think that's necessarily true. In some cases it is, and there's no question about it. Some people have classical OCD, and really that's almost dominating their circumstances. I have to say that OCD is one of the better ones. You picked on one which in fact is more justified than many of the others, and that's why it wasn't on my list originally. But I'm not saying get rid of Spitzer, but and as you say, you can do modifications of CBT for different things, but that doesn't really mean that we ought to forget about the general background. And that's one of my big worries, is that we fail to follow up people with common mental disorders. Most of the studies that show evidence of efficacy have been short term. In the longer term, I fear that we would have the same findings as the Nottingham study. I know that Woody's been changed forever because he's very good at being changed. That's good. I hope my Romanian colleagues have understood my rather fast speech, and they understand that most of the people they will see have the general neurotic syndrome, and because it will be a mixture of all these symptoms for most people who present to community services. And what I find concerning is that most people in community services don't recognize the personality component there. They only recognize it in this highly unfortunate term borderline, which is not part of what I'm talking about. Phil Harrison Reed's got a question.
Can you hear me, Peter?
Yeah, I can hear you, yeah.
Peter, I think we need to also give credit to Eve Johnston and the Northwick Park Neurosis trial, which was published in 1980. It was a short-term trial, wasn't it? Just 4 weeks, with a group of about 250 patients. And she was unable to separate out anxiety and depression in this group of neurotic patients, and found
yes, you're quite right.
Amitriptyline had a good effect in all of these patients, much better than the benzodiazepine.
Yeah,
that was a very early study, which was working along the same lines as your own Nottingham study, really.
Yeah, you're quite right. Although it wasn't a long-term study, and I should have mentioned that, but of course it's interesting that Sir Martin Roth had a much bigger impact on practice than Eve Johnston. People like to have sort of clear directions. They don't like the idea of too much fuzziness. Well, while you're thinking about further questions, I'd just like to add that the new classification of personality disorder, which is called ICD-11, which is now going to come out. It should have come out in this country earlier, but in fact it was accepted and formally recognised on the January the 1st this year, and has yet to be unrolled. I'm meeting the NHS England later on this month to try and see if we can get ICD-11 unrolled across the country. But this allows personality disturbance to be classified on a spectrum, and that goes between personality difficulty and severe personality disorder. Most people with a general neurotic syndrome have personality difficulty or mild personality disorder. It's not something which is very prominent, but is relevant to, I think, to this question of environmental change. We have one of the problems with vulnerable people with the general neurotic syndrome is they're very afraid of change, and you've got to, they want change, but they're afraid of it. And so you have to encourage them to move on and make the decisions. They've got to make the decisions, and that's what we do in nidotherapy. I've got a question from Woody now saying, how do family members respond to nidotherapy for their loved ones? I think they do remarkably well. One of the advantages of involving family members, they often realize the personality difficulties that people have, which need perhaps to be modified or at least nullified to some extent by a change of environment, better than the individuals themselves do. And certainly in our nidotherapy work, we often involve the family in making decisions, because sometimes I've just had recently a person who needed to break off from a relationship which was absolutely pathological, and he didn't know what to do, even though he wanted to do it, and his family members helped him enormously because they fully realized that was the right way forward. So there's no doubt that family members can be incredibly helpful here. I will add one comment, because I don't really. Oh, David's added, say, do we have to wait for ICD-12 to get a general neurotic syndrome? Well, unfortunately, ICD-12, as you say, David, is probably going to be another 30 years now. But I think the new personality classification, which I mentioned before, is coming out, is out, and David's pointed to what is called the negative affective domain, which is the one which covers the general neurotic syndrome. The unfortunate thing about that domain is that it overlaps with this awful word borderline, which covers everything under the sun, and we've got to separate off the borderline part of it, which is fluctuating mood disturbance, from general neurotic syndrome mood disturbance, negative affectivity, which is there almost all the time. That's the big difference in the general neurotic syndrome. People don't lose their symptoms altogether. They maintain their neuroticism over a long period. And I'm not sure if there are any old age psychiatrists on the call, but most of the evidence, and it's rather depressing, suggests that older people have more of these symptoms, more anxiety and neuroticism later in life than they do earlier. So the idea it gets better as you get older doesn't seem to apply. And certainly at 30 years, we found the biggest changes, negative changes, even after 12 years. It wasn't too bad. After 30 years, they were worse off. So I think we've got to really look at making positive environmental and other changes. I mean, there are other ways of dealing with it, and I'm not discounting psychotherapeutic ones. We had a long call with Paul Gilbert yesterday at Imperial College, in which he was talking about compassionate focus therapy, which is obviously, I think, a very important addition to the armamentarium of treatment. But we must pay attention to people in the longer term. And now Lavinia from Sibiu in Romania said, oh, good, because she's pointing out that her residents in Romania are hearing about this rather than the DSM or ICD criteria. So I hope you can do this. And you mustn't be afraid to mention this in publications and in presentations. This is good science behind this. It's not just thought up on the back of an envelope, and it's not just, this has been something which has been around for a long time, and a lot of people agree with it. And if you read the foreword again of Bob Kendall in the book, you'll realize that what he said in 1989 is just as apposite today. And there's another comment from Jacob, and saying that is there evidence that established treatments intended for personality disorder and difficulty, DBT, MBT, etc., improve life for people with general neurotic syndrome? Well, we don't know, Jacob, because it's not being used. One of the problems that we have with these specialist treatments is that because they're so specialist, they're only given to the most severe cases. In the case of emotionally unstable personality disorder, at the lower end of the scale, no one ever gives these treatments, or if they do, they give it in the form of structured clinical management, which we know is just as good. And I think, but paying attention not just to the symptoms, but to their personality disturbance, just repeating the story over and over again is going to make a better outcome. People often say to me, why are you so successful in treating your patients? Now, I'm not sure that's strictly true, but I often say it's because I made the subject into a three-dimensional one from a two-dimensional one, because I get their personality status right before I decide to prescribe and decide what's needed for them. And they have to decide that. It's a collaborative exercise. That is the reason why we do well. One of the big advantages of nidotherapy as a treatment, which I'm really pushing in the NHS, and it's now being adopted in various NHS facilities throughout the country, is that you are asking the patient to make the decision. And that is in tune with current thinking. You don't adopt a paternalistic attitude and say, I know what's best for you. You need to go into a sanatorium. They decide what they want after you've talked about it with them and decided on the obstacles in the way and tried to get round them. Well, thank you very much for attending, and thank you for, is there anything you wanted to say, Stephen, because you haven't been fielding the questions that will come up on chat? Is there anything you wanted to say?
When you look at the in the 30-year follow-up, about 44% of people with general neurotic syndrome did very well because they moved out of Nottingham or they changed their life circumstance. Now, it seems to me that when you take those people out and you look at all the people with general neurotic syndrome, in fact, the outcome for people with GNS is actually much worse, because quite a number of people get better.
Yes, it is. It would be a lot worse, because obviously within this whole group, we have this population, small population, which has had positive environmental change, which have got better. And the ones who are left behind are much worse than they were at the beginning. One thing which I didn't mention, which is perhaps relevant, is that those who stayed in Nottingham, this was a Nottingham study, tended to do worse, and we did find that they died younger as well. But most people with the general neurotic syndrome don't die prematurely. We've done another study which shows that. So they have miserable lives, but don't do well. And often in later life, quite a few of the people were moved from the centre of Nottingham to outer nursing homes on the edges, and they had really isolated lives then and were much worse off when they were moved out. So there are a lot of things. I think housing authorities and others ought to be taking more notice of these matters as well. And you may have seen various papers on social prescribing recently, which has come under a lot of attack, because most of the studies on social prescribing have showed no benefit. But social prescribing is concerned with environmental change. The trouble is it's not properly synchronized and organized, but whereas nidotherapy is, it focuses on all the possible environmental changes and comes up with a solution that is best for everybody. So if you want to look at how there's a big study being carried out on social prescribing, which is now widely used across the health service and which has a very poor evidence base. Nidotherapy has a much better one. We have to leave the webinar now, and thank you very much for all of you for attending and for being so attentive and interested. And as I said at the beginning, I do hope this will change your lives, even only in a very small way. Thank you very much indeed. Bye.